Let's speak about clones and cloning. Let's speak about China, with the mysterious population boom of those 20 years between 1980 and 2000, in the 1980s and 1990s. Between 1980 and 2000, the official population of China jumped by numbers so high and so big that are difficult to explain with a combination of what we consider natural, which is natural births and counting and migration. Especially worrying is because the population boom happened during these 20 years when China had closed borders, no free press, and the strict one-child policy, which was so famous in those 20 years. At around the same time, they were building these huge, large empty cities with empty buildings. Between 1982 and the year 2000, the census counted an increase in 254 million people, 254 million Chinese. The numbers don't add up, no matter how you want to push it mathematically. Unregistered adults, especially in a bureaucracy-obsessed communist dictatorship where every small detail has to be registered, it doesn't account. So it doesn't make sense. Demographers who study this thing academically, they call it the largest unexplained residual in census history. And we have, for example, the city of Shenzhen, which today everybody knows about Shenzhen because of the media. But the city of Shenzhen in China went from 30,000 people in 1979 to 7 million people in 2000. In 20 years, it went from 30,000 people to 7 million. It doesn't matter how much natural birth you have and migration, you don't do that in 20 years. And of course, we have the famous, which pretty much nobody speaks about this anymore, the empty ghost cities that China has built. Were these cities meant for the clones? The buildings themselves in the cities, they're just like cloned buildings, identical copy-paste construction work. And of course, they're empty cities. So is this because the cities were built to provide for the clones, but then the project for cloning was shut down, so the cities remained empty, just like that in the middle of all of China, right? And also it happens in many other countries. Now, before you start saying that I'm a crazy whatever in my corner, once you research what people from China say, because of course you have to understand what the Chinese say, the natural Chinese people. As you know, as in any country, we have forums and things that only happen in the language of the country. China is no exception. China has Weibo and other forums where Chinese people discuss the matters of China. So this is like the type of information and type of conversation that the Chinese were asking on these forums. One of the Chinese guys says, my 1990s college classmates from Hebei, which is a region in China, half the dorm had no photos before age 18. No hometown anecdotes, same exact height and teeth. Imagine. Clones. Another Chinese person was saying, in 1998 Shenzhen factory hiring boom. Lots of work for people. They bust in, so they brought with buses 20,000 workers for the factory in Shenzhen in 1 week. All the workers, all the 20,000 workers were early 20s, all spoke perfect Mandarin with no regional accent, and all single with no family contact. 20,000 bust in to work in a factory. Then we have the elderly, old people, Chinese villagers in Henan and Sichuan in the early 2000s, swearing that entire neighboring villages appeared in 1992 and 1993. They said, the old people said, 1 year everything was just cornfields, there was no people. The next year you have 5,000 young adults building houses. Just like that. Young adults, not children or like orphans. Young adults ready for work and ready to multiply themselves. Then we have all these birth years which were faked. There's like if you go to China and you want to go by household registration from rural places, there's no records. There's nothing, and there's so many like records which either are fake or just created and invented, but there's no actual facts. Also, it goes for school records and hospital birth certificates, etc., for millions of people. And there's this local things that happen locally in different local areas in China in the late 1980s, when they were given the orders to the local authorities in different municipalities and towns. They were saying, the government was saying, you have to register X amount of people, X million people, a number of million of people, which were previously unaccounted for, so nobody knew their origin, but you have to register them in your local town or in your local area, because if you don't, you lose the funding from the Chinese Communist Party, right? And of course, invented names, invented records, backdated files, fantasy dates, nothing else. And not to mention there's these 41 million people that are supposed to have come from the rural area, from the villages in China. There's no paperwork. So 41 million people, new people in the cities, they said, oh, they come from the villages to work. But there's no records of them living in the villages and no paper records, nothing else. It's just amazing. Now, of course, you could say, well, what if the one-child policy that China had in those 20 years between 1980 and 2000, what if the child policy was just fake and people were allowed to have sex and multiply themselves as they wanted fit, and the one-child policy was just for outside the borders for people to believe that that was happening in China? We don't know, but we have the typical thing that we know of, that the communists in China were saying stop having babies, and on the other hand, the population of China exploded to 254 million people in the same years when the communists were saying stop having babies. So what if the goal was not population reduction, but it was population replacement, and the goal was for people not to have babies so that they could just bring clones, the clone programming? No. Everybody knows. We can speak more about the cloning process. I mean, cloning, I'm not going to cover it in this video, because if I do it in this video, it's going to be too long. But I'm going to tell you about the cloning process, which is something very legal and very normal. And you can learn about it. There's nothing prohibitive or forbidden to know about it. It's just people don't want to learn about it. So, maybe it is possible that the one-child policy wasn't enforced in China. I don't know. Who knows what happened in between 1980 and 2000? But you cannot escape from those empty ghost cities, which are everywhere in China. The fact that the population, for example, not just China, other countries as well. India increased by 300 million people between the same period. From 1980 to 2000, India's population went a plus of 300 million people. The population of the Middle East and Africa exploded during this time as well, during these 20 years, from 1980 to 2000. And the researchers, when they're asked about the questions about why the explosion, why the boom of people in this period of time, they say, oh, it's because these countries have higher fertility rates. That's a lie, because in Europe, a woman gets pregnant if she wants to, just like that. It's not because of the highest fertility rate, because if you want to get pregnant, you can get pregnant. So they don't offer explanations why these fertility rates in China, India, and the Middle East and Africa, all of a sudden, they dropped after the year 2000. It was a boom from 1980 to 2000, and then once the year 2000 started, boom, everything drops. So people decided not to be fertile anymore. Fertility rates have dropped in virtually all countries that experienced population booms during the 1980s and 1990s. Just like that. Abruptly and unnaturally. And then, so are we just going to say, oh, people decide not to have kids anymore in these countries, in China, India, and the Middle East and Africa? What if we can speak about cloning and clones? And cloning and clones means population engineering, the mass introduction of clones. Now, do you understand why President Trump sometimes he speaks about China? If you listen closely when he says things about China and India, it's clones and cloning is a very serious thing, and unfortunately, there's things I cannot say here. I'm going to try to make videos on Rumble, on my Rumble channel. I have a channel on Rumble which is called Divergent or DivergentTruth, and I can say more on Rumble whenever if I decide to make videos about cloning at some point in the future, because it's so stressful to speak about these things. And yeah, I'll make it. So yeah, if you give me lots of likes to this video, we'll speak more about clones if you want.